She arranged for him to fail in front of the entire class. Yet when he solved a problem that even graduate students found challenging, everyone in the room began to see her in an entirely new light. The vast lecture hall at the University of Michigan hummed with the low, continuous chatter of students settling into their seats, flipping through the well-worn pages of their notebooks and unlocking their laptops. It was, by all accounts, just another Tuesday morning in Professor Linda Cartwright's advanced calculus class, a class notorious not only for its notorious difficulty, but also for the professor's uncompromising, brutal teaching style. Professor Cartwright was a woman who exuded authority the moment she stepped into any room. With her sharp features, silver-rimmed glasses, and an unyielding, no-nonsense gaze, she had the uncanny ability to make even the most confident students shrink in their seats. Her reputation had been meticulously built on precision, discipline, and an unwavering demand for excellence. If a student wished to pass her class, they would have to earn it through sheer hard work. There were no shortcuts, and she offered no sympathy. On that particular day, she was in no mood for any form of nonsense. Striding purposefully to the front of the room, her high-heeled shoes clicked against the tiled floor, and in one swift, deliberate motion, she snapped a piece of chalk between her fingers. The entire room fell into a heavy silence. "All right," she said, brushing a stray blonde lock from her face. "Last lecture we covered multivariable limits. Today we will push forward with Laplace transforms." With that, she turned to the board and began writing long, intricate equations that sprawled across the surface in a neat, perfect script. As the professor wrote, students scrambled to take notes, some already lost in the maze of symbols, while others merely pretended to understand. Professor Cartwright thrived in this very environment, the struggle, the pressure, and the silent, competitive atmosphere. Deep down, she believed that most students would flounder, and frankly, she preferred it that way. It reinforced her conviction that only the truly gifted belonged in her world. At least, that was what she thought. Somewhere near the middle of the hall sat one student who was not struggling, nor was he panicking. If anything, he appeared disinterested. His name was Daniel Reed, a tall, lean young man who always dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans. Daniel was not the type of student to draw attention. He rarely spoke in class and never made a spectacle of himself. Yet beneath that quiet demeanor, his mind worked at a pace far beyond that of his peers. Numbers, patterns, and equations seemed to come together for him in a way that was incomprehensible for others. As he glanced at the board, his eyes quickly scanned the equation. There was something off. Just a small mistake, a minor error, but an error nonetheless. Daniel hesitated for a moment. He could easily let it go as no one else appeared to notice. But then again, if Professor Cartwright discovered the mistake later, she might circle back and waste valuable time correcting it. Before he could decide, another student raised her hand hesitantly. Professor Cartwright, I think there's an error in the second line," she said softly from the front row. Professor Cartwright turned slowly, arching an eyebrow at the interruption. "An error?" she repeated, as if the very notion was offensive. Scanning the board once more, she then smirked. "There is no error," she declared flatly. The girl's face immediately turned red, and she quickly lowered her gaze in embarrassment. Daniel exhaled and shook his head slightly. He despised the way some professors dismissed their students, as if they were too proud ever to make a mistake. Before he could restrain himself any longer, his hand shot upward. "Actually," he said calmly, "there is an error." At those words, a ripple of murmurs spread throughout the room. Heads turned as all eyes fixed on him. Although Professor Cartwright's expression did not change overtly, for just a split second irritation flickered in her eyes. "Oh," she said, crossing her arms. "Enlighten me," she challenged. Daniel rose from his seat, not out of arrogance or to put on a show, but simply because he despised speaking while seated. "In the second step, you applied the transformation to the wrong term," he explained, pointing at the board. "The coefficient does not carry over that way. If you solve it using your method, the final answer does not match the expected result." An expectant silence fell over the room, punctuated only by the soft scratch of chalk on the board. Professor Cartwright's jaw tensed as she turned back to the board, scanning her own work. Then, much to everyone's surprise, there it was, the mistake. Her grip on the chalk tightened momentarily, and for a brief second Daniel thought she might simply admit the error and move on. Instead, her lips curled into a tight smile. "Well, Mr. Reed," she said, turning to face him, "since you seem so confident, why don't you come up here and show us the correct way?" A few students chuckled under their breath, and Daniel could almost hear the unspoken message behind her words. She did not want to acknowledge that he was right. Intent on not letting her undermine his clarity, Daniel set down his notebook and walked calmly to the front of the room. Taking the chalk from her hand, he stepped up to the board, feeling the weight of the room's expectations pressing in on him. The professor's gaze bore into his back as silent murmurs from his fellow students filled the space, wondering if he was about to make a fool of himself. But Daniel was not nervous. With smooth, deliberate strokes, he erased the incorrect part of the equation and rewrote it. His handwriting was not as neat as Professor Cartwright's, but that was unimportant. What mattered was that the numbers lined up perfectly. As he worked, his voice remained even and casual. "The mistake lies in the way the transform was applied," he explained. "You carried the coefficient outside too early, which altered the integral limits. However, if you solve it this way, it preserves the function's integrity." The only sound in the room was the soft, continuous scratch of chalk against the board. After completing the equation, Daniel set the chalk down and stepped back. He then turned to face Professor Cartwright, whose expression remained rigid, arms crossed and lips pressed together. It was evident she was not accustomed to being corrected, especially not in front of an entire lecture hall. Daniel could see in her eyes that she wanted to dismiss him, to brush off his correction, and perhaps even find a way to twist the situation so that she could maintain her authority. Instead, she took a slow, measured breath and nodded curtly. "Fine, you corrected it. Congratulations." A few students exchanged glances, but that was all. There was no further acknowledgement, no actual praise. Daniel did not need any praise. He simply returned to his seat, fully aware of the many eyes of his classmates upon him, some filled with admiration, others with irritation, likely from those who believed he was showing off. But Daniel was not showing off, he simply despised errors, especially those that could have been avoided. Professor Cartwright turned back to the board and wiped away Daniel's work. "Let's move on," she said briskly. "Since Mr. Reed is so eager to contribute, I assume he won't mind another challenge." Daniel blinked in confusion for a moment, but before he could speak, Professor Cartwright was already writing again. This time she filled half the board with a much longer equation, replete with integrals, limits, and a particularly tricky differential component. With a final flourish, she finished writing the last symbol and then turned to face him. "Since you have such a keen eye," she said coolly, "solve this." A few students shifted in their seats as Daniel stared at the new equation. Instantly he understood what she was doing. She was trying to make an example out of him. This was not a normal question for an undergraduate course. The complexity of the problem made it abundantly clear that she did not expect him to solve it correctly. It was as if she intended for him to hesitate, to stumble over the steps, or even to start the problem and then falter midway, so that she could later step in and remind the class why she was the ultimate authority in the room. Daniel exhaled slowly through his nose. "Fine," he said, rising once again and returning to the board. A few students chuckled softly under their breath, clearly anticipating that he would struggle. Professor Cartwright smirked, stepping back and folding her arms. "Take your time," she said, almost tauntingly. Yet Daniel did not need any extra time. Picking up the chalk, he began to write without hesitation or second-guessing. Every symbol flowed from his mind to his hand as if by instinct, and he did not even pause to think. His brain was already several steps ahead, visualizing the entire solution long before his fingers had completed the previous line. The murmurs in the room died down to silence, and even Professor Cartwright's smirk began to fade halfway through the equation. Daniel glanced at her momentarily. "I assume you want the solution in terms of exponentials rather than trigonometric functions?" he inquired. She did not answer, and he continued, adding a few more steps and simplifications until, finally, he boxed the final answer and turned to face the class with an air of calm confidence. A profound silence fell over the room. Professor Cartwright's face was unreadable as she scanned his work line by line, searching for any possible error that she might use to dismiss his solution, but there was nothing. Daniel had solved the problem correctly, and not only correctly, but elegantly. The solution was clean and efficient. A few students began whispering, and others leaned forward, clearly realizing what had just occurred. Daniel crossed his arms, not smiling or gloating, but simply waiting. Finally, Professor Cartwright broke the silence, her voice noticeably tighter than before. "Lucky guess," she said with a tone that suggested even a few students found it amusing, though not at Daniel's expense. He tilted his head slightly. "It wasn't a guess," he replied matter-of-factly. "I simply calculated it mentally." At that, a few murmurs rippled through the room, but the professor remained silent, her expression one of reluctant acceptance. She took a slow breath, then said, "Sit down, Mr. Reed." With no further argument, Daniel returned to his seat. He could feel the shift in the room as people began to regard him in a new light, some with admiration, some with resentment, and for Professor Cartwright, with something else entirely. Yet she was far from finished. The energy in the room had undeniably changed, and it was clear that no one was looking at Professor Cartwright in the same way they had at the beginning of the class. Daniel had not intended to embarrass her, that had never been his goal. Instead, he had simply let the truth of the numbers speak for themselves. As she turned back to the board, her hand gripping the chalk with increased force, her voice lost some of its usual authority. Suddenly, without warning, she stopped mid-sentence, turned to face the entire class, and her gaze finally landed on him. "If you're so confident, Mr. Reed," she said, forcing a smile that did little to hide her irritation, "how about we raise the stakes?" A few students chuckled, while others leaned forward in anticipation, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Daniel did not react immediately. "What do you mean?" he asked softly. Professor Cartwright walked over to her desk and pulled out a thick textbook. Flipping through the pages with deliberate care, she eventually stopped at a section far beyond the material they had covered in class. She held the book up so that the entire class could see the dense, intimidating equations printed on its pages. "This," she said, tapping a particularly formidable problem, "is taken from an advanced graduate-level course. Something I would never expect an undergraduate to be able to solve." A murmur spread through the room, yet her eyes remained fixed on him. "But since you appear to possess a natural talent for this, why don't you prove it?" she challenged, smiling coldly. Her eyes, however, were sharp and calculating. Daniel exhaled slowly as he absorbed her words. In that moment, he realized that this was no longer simply about mathematics, it was a personal contest. Professor Cartwright's challenge was not meant to offer him an opportunity, rather it was a calculated setup designed to break him. She was testing not only his mathematical prowess, but also his ability to withstand pressure, to perform flawlessly under the gaze of an audience. If he were to fail, it wouldn't merely be in front of his classmates. It would be in front of professors, graduate students, and some of the brightest minds in the field. The weight of the room's expectations bore down on him. Everyone was waiting to see if he would back down or press on. Daniel knew that if he hesitated or refused the challenge, it would only confirm her belief that he was not as capable as he appeared. And so, with quiet determination, he exhaled and nodded. "I'm in," he said firmly. A momentary pause followed before Professor Cartwright's smile reappeared, though it never quite reached her eyes. "Excellent," she replied curtly. News of the challenge spread quickly. By the time Daniel stepped out of the lecture hall, students were already whispering about the upcoming competition. In the corridors, some nodded at him with newfound respect, while others regarded him with the same intensity one might reserve for an athlete on the verge of entering a championship game. They were all curious, expectant, and eager to see if he would live up to the hype. Daniel, however, barely paid attention to the hushed conversations. He had bigger things to focus on: the Symposium, which was scheduled to take place in 4 weeks. That meant he had 4 weeks to prepare for a competition that many spent months, and sometimes even years, training for. That night, in the quiet solitude of the campus library, Daniel settled into a corner surrounded by stacks of textbooks and notebooks filled with calculations. His desk was cluttered with the remnants of long study sessions, including a half-empty coffee cup that had long since gone cold. Mathematics had always been a passion of his, but now it felt different. It wasn't just about numbers on a page. This was personal. The challenge had stoked a fire within him, and he found himself burning the midnight oil as he reviewed complex theories and practiced intricate problems. As he immersed himself in his studies, he could almost feel the eyes of the entire class, and particularly those of Professor Cartwright, still lingering on him from the earlier challenge. Every calculation, every proof, and every equation was now imbued with the weight of expectation. The following day, as Daniel made his way to class, the atmosphere seemed charged with a new intensity. He slid into his usual seat, mentally preparing himself for what might come next. When Professor Cartwright entered a few minutes later, she appeared just as composed as ever, but as she scanned the room, her eyes eventually landed on Daniel, and something in her expression had changed. A subtle yet unmistakable hint of respect. Clearing her throat, she addressed the class in a measured tone. "Before we begin today's lecture, I would like to acknowledge the results of yesterday's symposium," she announced. A heavy silence fell over the room. Daniel Reed took first place in a competition against some of the best mathematical minds in the country. Her voice remained even, though the statement itself was far from trivial. A few students clapped, and Brian, one of her favored students, shot Daniel a knowing grin. With that, Professor Cartwright turned back to the board. "Let's begin," she declared, and that simple acknowledgement, delivered without excessive praise or grandiloquent speeches, resonated deeply with everyone present. For Daniel, it was not a matter of proving himself to her. It was about proving something to himself. That sometimes the most profound changes in perception are brought about not through elaborate words, but through the undeniable clarity of truth. In the days that followed, the tension in the classroom slowly gave way to a kind of wary admiration. Daniel's performance had shifted the dynamics within the class. Conversations about the challenge and his subsequent victory spread like wildfire, with students speculating about what might come next. Some believed that his remarkable talent would soon earn him a place in a more advanced class, while others, still nursing bruised egos, quietly resented the disruption to the established order. Professor Cartwright, however, maintained a professional demeanor. While she never openly praised Daniel, her lectures and interactions began to reflect a subtle shift, a recognition, perhaps grudgingly acknowledged, of his extraordinary abilities. Then, as the weeks passed and the symposium loomed ever closer, Daniel found himself immersed in an intense schedule of preparation. Every afternoon, he would lock himself in the library, poring over complex mathematical theories and practicing countless problems until the concepts became second nature. The challenge, initially intended as a trap to break his spirit, had instead ignited a relentless drive within him. Late into the night, the soft hum of his desk lamp and the scratch of his pen against paper became the soundtrack to his determination. Occasionally, he would catch a glimpse of Brian, who would saunter over with a teasing smile. "Dude, you're already ahead of half the competitors in these things," Brian would say, his tone half joking, half sincere. Daniel would simply nod, silently acknowledging the truth in those words. Yet, deep down, a nagging thought persisted. Why had Professor Cartwright chosen him for this challenge? Was it purely because she wanted to humiliate him? Or was there some other, more complex calculation behind her decision? Despite his inner questions, Daniel remained resolute. Every time he recited a set of equations or reviewed a complex proof, he reaffirmed his commitment to defy the expectations placed upon him. In his mind, this was not just a battle of numbers, it was a struggle to redefine himself on his own terms. He was determined to show that talent, when nurtured with discipline and passion, could triumph even over the most daunting challenges. And so, with unwavering focus, he prepared for the day when he would once again have to demonstrate his abilities before an audience of esteemed judges and skeptical onlookers. That day eventually arrived. 4 weeks later, Daniel found himself standing in a large auditorium-style lecture hall at the University of Pennsylvania, his heart pounding in his chest as he stared at a panel of judges and the long digital timer displayed above the stage. Competitors were seated in assigned places, their desks equipped with scratch paper and pens, each armed with the simple yet daunting directive, solve the problems faster and more accurately than anyone else. Among the audience sat Professor Cartwright, her presence both a reminder of past challenges and a silent gauge of his progress. Though she had offered him little more than a nod in the days leading up to the symposium, her eyes burned with an intensity that Daniel recognized all too well. The competition began with a round of mental math, a test of pure calculation without the aid of written work. While many competitors hesitated, Daniel's hands moved with unerring precision, inputting numbers into the response system faster than the proctors could even blink. Next came the theoretical application round, where participants were required to break down complex concepts into coherent proofs. Here, Daniel's natural intuition shone through, as numbers and abstract ideas coalesced into a series of logical, interconnected statements. The final round, speed solving, proved to be the most nerve-wracking. It was during this phase that even the best competitors often stumbled under the immense pressure, second-guessing every step they took. But Daniel, undeterred by the ticking clock and the silent intensity of the room, pressed on with relentless determination. As the final round neared its conclusion, only two competitors remained in serious contention: Daniel Reed and a PhD candidate from MIT. The last problem appeared on the digital screen, a brutal confluence of layered integrals and nested summations, designed to test not only knowledge but sheer mental endurance. Daniel's pulse steadied as he picked up his pen. He exhaled deeply and began writing, his mind racing through the layers of complexity faster than he could put them to paper. Every part of the equation had to be perfect, with no room for shortcuts or miscalculations. Meanwhile, he could hear the faint, hurried scribbling of his competitor, the MIT candidate, whose determination was equally evident. In those final moments, as the clock ticked down and the seconds stretched into an eternity, Daniel saw a pattern, a shortcut, a unique insight that no one else would recognize. His hand moved with a precision and speed that defied the tension of the moment, slashing through the numbers and simplifying expressions in ways that were almost instinctive. Without pausing for a moment to double-check his work, he confidently boxed the final answer and set his pen down. The timer buzzed, marking the end of the competition, and Daniel looked up. His breathing was steady, and though his competitor was still writing, the room was enveloped in a deep, almost palpable silence. One of the judges eventually rose and approached both competitors, examining their answers with a meticulous eye. The tension in the room was so thick it could have been cut with a knife. After what felt like an interminable pause, the judge raised his microphone. "The winner of the 2025 University Mathematics Symposium is Daniel Reed," he announced. The room erupted. Some students clapped enthusiastically, while others could only express audible gasps of disbelief. Daniel, however, did not react immediately. Instead, he exhaled slowly, letting the reality of his achievement sink in. He had won, not merely against his fellow students, but against the heavy expectations placed on him, against a professor who had once doubted him, and against the unspoken assumptions that had sought to define him before he had even begun to define himself. The next morning, as Daniel entered class and took his usual seat, the atmosphere was noticeably altered. A few minutes later, Professor Cartwright arrived. She appeared as composed as ever, yet this time when she scanned the room, her gaze landed on Daniel with an unmistakable note of respect. Clearing her throat, she began the lecture in a tone that was steady and measured. "I would like to acknowledge the results of yesterday's symposium," she said, pausing as the room fell silent. "Daniel Reed took first place in a competition against some of the best mathematical minds in the country." Her voice remained even. No elaborate praise, no flowery language, just a simple acknowledgement that carried immense weight. A few students clapped, and Brian shot Daniel a knowing grin. With that, Professor Cartwright turned back to the board and continued, "Let's begin." In that moment, the silence, the acknowledgement, and the respect conveyed far more than any elaborate speech ever could. It was the sound of undeniable truth. Reflecting on the events, Daniel realized that the journey had been about far more than just solving equations. It had been a confrontation with authority, a test of his ability to rise above expectations, and a personal declaration that talent and hard work, when met with determination, could overcome even the most intimidating challenges. In the weeks and months that followed, the classroom dynamics shifted subtly but irrevocably. Professor Cartwright's once imperious demeanor seemed tempered by an unspoken acknowledgement of Daniel's abilities. While she continued to demand precision and discipline, there was now an undercurrent of mutual respect that neither she nor her students could ignore. As the semester progressed, Daniel continued to excel not just in mathematics but in every challenge he encountered. The memory of that pivotal moment, the day he had corrected a mistake in a rigorous advanced calculus class, and the subsequent challenge that had culminated in his victory at the symposium, remained etched in his mind. It served as a reminder that sometimes the most significant victories are those won by staying true to oneself, by letting one's passion and talent shine through even under the weight of expectation and doubt. In subsequent classes, when complex problems were introduced, whispers of admiration often followed Daniel's every contribution. Fellow students who had once doubted him now looked to him for guidance, and even those who had resented him began to appreciate the quiet strength he exhibited in the face of adversity. Professor Cartwright herself, while never overtly praising him, began to incorporate more nuanced challenges in her lectures, challenges that acknowledged the breadth of talent in her classroom while still maintaining the rigorous standards she was known for. Over time, the initial spark of rivalry between teacher and student transformed into a more balanced dynamic. Daniel, with his calm demeanor and unwavering focus, became a symbol of what could be achieved when intellect was coupled with perseverance. And Professor Cartwright, for all her sternness and relentless pursuit of perfection, was forced to confront the fact that sometimes even the most meticulously planned lessons could yield unexpected results. The classroom had become a place where not only the brilliance of mathematics was celebrated, but where the human spirit, the courage to stand up, to speak out, and to challenge the status quo, found its own form of expression. As the academic year unfolded, the story of that fateful Tuesday continued to circulate among students and faculty alike, a living reminder of the day when numbers, logic, and determination converged to transform perceptions. Daniel's success was more than just a victory in a competition. It was a moment of truth that redefined the boundaries of what was possible in a world governed by equations and rules. And for Professor Cartwright, it was a humbling experience that, though she would never openly admit it, perhaps softened her stance ever so slightly towards the unyielding ideal of perfection. Looking back on those events, one cannot help but notice that the true essence of the story lies not in the details of a single mathematical problem or the harsh words exchanged in a lecture hall, but in the quiet determination of a young man who refused to be defined by the limitations others imposed upon him. In his journey from a reserved, overlooked student to a celebrated champion of mathematical prowess, Daniel Reed demonstrated that sometimes the most profound lessons are learned not from textbooks, but from the courage to challenge authority and the will to prove that errors, even those set up by design, can be overcome through clarity of thought and the relentless pursuit of truth. In the end, it was not the accolades or the applause that mattered to Daniel. It was the silent acknowledgement that, in that moment of truth, he had chosen to trust his own abilities over the rigid expectations of those around him, and in doing so he had not only reshaped the way his peers viewed him, but had also forced an esteemed professor to confront the undeniable fact that sometimes the best way to change people's minds is not with elaborate words, but with the clear, indisputable language of mathematics. Thus, in the quiet aftermath of that transformative day, as the lecture hall gradually emptied and the echoes of whispered conversations faded into memory, one truth remained. Every challenge, every mistake, and every moment of doubt was but a stepping stone towards something greater, a testament to the enduring power of perseverance, intellect, and the courage to stand alone in the face of overwhelming expectation. And so, as Daniel Reed continued to carve out his own path, one equation at a time, the lesson remained clear for all who witnessed it. Even in a room full of uncertainty, when one is willing to risk failure for the sake of truth, the eventual triumph can shine as brightly as any accolade, forever altering the course of one's destiny.